The noise around Caitlin Clark was never quiet, it was loud, relentless, and at times completely disconnected from reality. From the moment she stepped into Indiana, narratives started flying. Locker room tension, jealousy, chemistry issues, body language breakdowns, every tiny moment dissected like it meant something bigger. And sitting right in the middle of all that chaos was Aaliyah Boston, watching the outside world confidently push a story that, from her perspective, simply did not exist. What makes her recent comments hit different is not just what she said, but how effortlessly she dismantled months of speculation without ever raising her voice. No emotional rant, no defensive tone, just calm truth that cuts deeper than any headline. She didn't describe dysfunction, she described growth. She didn't hint at division, she showed unity. And most importantly, she didn't frame Caitlin Clark as a problem, she framed her as a force. When Boston reflected on her first real connection with Clark, it wasn't built on hype or media narratives, it was built on memory, competition, and respect forged under pressure. She remembered exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of Clark's dominance, to watch her drop 40 on the biggest stage, to feel that sting, and then suddenly have that same player walk in as your teammate. That's not just a storyline, that's a psychological shift, and instead of letting that past turn into ego or resentment, Boston turned it into humor, into honesty, into something real. That moment alone tells you everything about her mindset. She's not insecure, she's not threatened, she's grounded. And that foundation is exactly why this partnership works. Because once they got past introductions and into real basketball, what started forming wasn't just chemistry, it was understanding at a level defenses struggle to deal with. Boston didn't talk about highlights or flashy plays, she talked about timing. About instincts, about reading eyes instead of calling for the ball. That's elite-level connection. That's the kind of unspoken communication that doesn't show up in box scores but breaks entire defensive systems. And when you really listen to her, you realize something dangerous is happening here. This isn't a duo trying to figure things out anymore. This is a duo starting to figure things out together. Meanwhile, all the noise about locker room drama? From Boston's point of view, it sounded almost laughable. She described waking up to narratives that felt like they were written by people who had never stepped foot inside that locker room. People analyzing facial expressions like they were decoding secrets. People confusing frustration from a bad game with some imaginary hatred toward teammates. And her response to all of it was simple: we're good. Not defensive, not elaborate, just real. That's what makes it hit. Because when someone inside the situation speaks that calmly about chaos that others are exaggerating, it exposes just how artificial the entire narrative really was. And without directly calling anyone out, her words naturally put critics, especially the loudest ones, into a very uncomfortable position. Because if the players themselves are telling you there's no issue, then what exactly have you been watching? What exactly have you been pushing? And this is where the conversation shifts from just perception to reality. Because what Aaliyah Boston really revealed wasn't just her opinion of Caitlin Clark, it was the truth about what's actually being built in Indiana. She acknowledged the Clark effect without hesitation, the attention, the pressure, the microscope that suddenly turned every possession into a headline. But instead of framing that as a burden, she framed it as opportunity. More eyes on the league, more fans discovering new players, more growth across the board. That perspective alone separates her from the noise. While others were focused on what Clark supposedly disrupted, Boston was focused on what she elevated. And at the same time, she made it clear that none of this was supposed to be instant. Chemistry doesn't happen overnight. Trust isn't automatic. And expecting a young team to perform like a finished product from day one is not just unrealistic, it's unfair. That's where a lot of the criticism completely missed the point. Because while the outside world was demanding perfection, the team itself was still building something real, piece by piece, possession by possession. Then came the adversity, the injuries, the lineup changes, the inconsistency that could have easily broken a less grounded group. And yet, instead of collapsing, Indiana adapted. Boston described a mentality that doesn't rely on excuses. Next player up, stay ready, keep moving. That mindset matters. Because when you lose a player like Clark, you don't just lose scoring, you lose pace, vision, gravity, the ability to stretch defenses before they're even set. Boston made that distinction clear. With Clark on the floor, everything speeds up, everything becomes more dangerous. Without her, the team shifts, slows down, executes differently. Not worse, just different. And learning to operate in both systems? That's what builds resilience. That's what prepares a team for bigger moments. And through all of it, Boston never once hinted at frustration toward Clark, only belief. Belief that she'll return, belief that the team will be stronger, belief that all this struggle is actually shaping something more complete. That's leadership. That's maturity. And that's why her voice carries weight. Because when she speaks, it doesn't sound like someone reacting to headlines, it sounds like someone who actually lived every moment of the season. And when you connect all of it, the respect, the chemistry, the resilience, the quiet dismissal of fake drama, you start to see the real picture. This isn't a fractured team. And here's where it gets even more uncomfortable for the people who have been pushing those narratives for months, because the deeper you go into what Aaliyah Boston actually said, the harder it becomes to hold on to the idea that something is broken in Indiana. What she described wasn't just chemistry, it was evolution under pressure. This wasn't a team falling apart under the spotlight, it was a team being forced to grow faster than anyone expected. And at the center of that growth is Caitlin Clark, not as some isolated superstar, not as a disruptive presence, but as a player whose very style forces everyone around her to elevate. Boston didn't hesitate when she talked about the way defenses react to Clark, how they collapse, how they panic, how they overcommit the second she comes off a screen. That kind of gravity doesn't just create opportunities, it demands awareness, timing, and trust from teammates. And Boston didn't just adapt to it, she leaned into it. She talked about getting into Clark's space, reading her eyes, anticipating passes before they happen. That's not basic teamwork, that's high-level synchronization. That's two players operating on the same wavelength without needing to speak. And once that kind of connection locks in, it doesn't fade, it sharpens. That's what makes this so dangerous for the rest of the league. Because while people were busy debating body language and overanalyzing every missed shot, these two were quietly building something that doesn't show up in viral clips but shows up when games are on the line. And the scary part? Boston made it clear they're still figuring it out. Still learning. Still growing. Which means what we've already seen might not even be the final version of what they can become. And if that's true, then all the criticism that painted this partnership as flawed wasn't just premature, it completely missed the trajectory. Because this isn't a pairing trying to survive the spotlight. And then there's the part that really flips the entire conversation, how Boston handled everything when things didn't go perfectly. Because it's easy to talk about chemistry when everything is clicking, when wins are stacking, when highlights are flowing. But what happens when injuries hit? When expectations crash into reality? When the player at the center of everything goes down and suddenly the entire system has to adjust? That's where teams get exposed. That's where cracks show. And yet, Boston didn't describe panic, she described control. She described a team that understood exactly what needed to be done, a mindset that didn't collapse just because circumstances changed. Losing Clark wasn't framed as an excuse, it was framed as a challenge. A shift. A test of identity. And instead of breaking under that weight, Indiana reshaped itself. Slower pace, different reads, more half-court execution, but still competitive, still fighting, still building. That tells you everything about the culture inside that locker room. Because teams that rely only on one player fall apart when that player disappears. But teams that are building something real? They adjust, they absorb, they evolve.